ChatGerry, a Viscoplastopology reflection on the Siberian Internment, Irreversible Human Damage Under Prolonged Forced Labor, No. 1492, VPT053, January 4, 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category, Humanity. Preface. Yesterday, I watched a Japanese television program, featuring survivors of what is known in Japan as the Siberian Internment. These were not dramatic stories filled with battlefield heroism or political speeches. They were quiet accounts told by elderly men, who had carried their memories for decades. Listening to them, I found myself unable to remain emotionally detached. Their stories forced me to reflect on a painful contrast in how defeated people were treated, after the same war had already ended. There were two wars between Japan and Russia, separated by about 40 years. The first, the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, ended with Japan's victory and marked its rise as a modern power. The second interaction occurred at the very end of World War II, in August 1945, as Japan was already collapsing under overwhelming pressure from the United States and the Pacific. The Soviet Union entered the war. On August 8, Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, just days before Japan announced its surrender. This timing matters. The Soviet invasion did not change the outcome of the World War II. Japan had already been defeated. What it changed was the fate of nearly a million people after the war stopped. After Japan's surrender, nearly 800,000 of Japanese soldiers and civilians in Manchuria were taken into Soviet custody. They were not treated as prisoners of war under international conventions. Instead, they were labeled labor internees and transported across Siberia, the Russian, Far East, and Central Asia. Many were absorbed into the Gulag labor system and assigned to logging, mining, railroad construction, factory work, and rebuilding military facilities, often in regions where winter temperatures fell below -30 degrees Celsius. In contrast, during the same period, the Chinese Nationalist government repatriated nearly 2 million Japanese soldiers and civilians between 1945 and 1947. Despite having suffered enormous losses during the war, China chose disarmament and return, rather than prolonged detention and forced labor. What struck me most was not military victory or political strategy, but the human outcome that followed victory. Under one path, defeated people returned home from China and Taiwan quickly, and began rebuilding broken lives. Under the other, nearly 1 million POW. Suffering was extended for 10 years after the war had already ended. Historical records estimate that roughly 8 to 10% of Japanese internees died, while in Soviet custody. Deaths were mainly due to malnutrition, exposure, exhaustion, and untreated illness. Though some resulted directly from violence or punishment, those who survived returned home, physically weakened, prematurely aged, and often chronically ill. Psychological suffering was widespread. Insomnia, nightmares, emotional withdrawal, depression, irritability, and survivor guilt were common. At the time, there was little language or support to address such wounds. Most endured them in silence. Survival did not mean recovery. For many, the damage lasted a lifetime. A systems view of irreversible damage. This paper does not seek to assign blame or revisit political arguments. Instead, it asks a simpler and more difficult question. What happens to human systems when stress is applied for too long? In my research work, I often distinguish between stress and strain. Stress is the force applied to a system. Strain is the permanent change that remains after the force is removed. Stress can end. Strain often does not. In the case of the Siberian Internment, stress took three main forms. The first was duration. Men were held for years, not months. The second was hard labor. Work was heavy, repetitive, and physically exhausting, often performed in extreme climates. The third was nutrition. Food was insufficient for the energy demanded, especially during the early years. These conditions did not fluctuate dramatically day to day. What mattered most was that they persisted. When stress is applied briefly, systems can often recover. When stress is applied continuously, damage accumulates. Over time, recovery becomes structurally impossible, even after conditions improve. This is a basic principle seen not only in engineering, but also in medicine, biology, and psychology. In simple terms, harsh conditions define how severe suffering is, but time determines how much irreversible damage accumulates. Historical data show that most long-term damage among internees occurred early and accumulated rapidly. By the early 1950s, even though conditions began to improve, and repatriation slowly increased, most irreversible harm had already been done. Later improvements reduced further injury, but could not undo what had already accumulated. This explains why elevated mortality and chronic illness persisted long after return to Japan. Despite better food, housing, and medical care, the system had crossed a point where recovery was limited, not by will or effort, but by structure, a geometric way of seeing loss. Another way to understand this process is to look at direction and trajectory, rather than data numbers. When we map survivability over time, the trajectory moves in one direction only. There are no loops, no reversals, and no return to earlier states. Even when labor intensity decreased or nutrition slightly improved, the overall path did not bend back. Once damage advanced, the system could not go backward. This is not unique to war prisoners. It is how many human systems fail, including human psychological and physical health conditions. A personal reflection. As I worked through these records and models, I began to recognize something deeply familiar. The fate of war prisoners mirrors that of patients with long-term metabolic disorders and personality disorders. In both cases, sustained stress slowly weakens the body's ability to recover. In both cases, long exposure leaves deep and lasting damage, so that, even after the original stress is reduced or removed, the consequences continue to shape health outcomes and mortality risk. When I reflect on this parallel, I realize that it fits my own past 36 years' health history perfectly. It explains why recovery is not a simple return to the past, but a long process of adaptation to permanent limitations. This realization has shaped my later years of work. I have come to believe that the most serious harm to human systems rarely comes from a single catastrophic event. It comes from sustained stress, endured silently, day after day, until recovery is no longer possible. Epilogue. I hope this paper meets the standard of a serious systems analysis, one that avoids moral overreach and political rhetoric. This restraint is intentional. The purpose is to understand irreversible damage, not to assign blame. Even though I have personal and somewhat biased opinions deep in my heart, after all, I am also a human being. While reviewing the history of the Siberian internment, I could not see these men as abstract data points, curves, or diagrams. They were ordinary people, much like you and me, caught in forces far beyond their control. Many were young, many never returned home the same, many never returned at all. This paper is not only about history or modeling, it is a reminder that behind every curve, every trajectory, and every analytical framework, there are human lives. Understanding how damage accumulates is not just an academic exercise. It is a way to remember, to learn, and perhaps to prevent future suffering. I am not using data to distance myself from pain. I am using data as another language to understand it. This is also why I chose medical research as the purpose of my life. During the last 16 years of my senior years, to face all kinds of suffering honestly rather than turn away from it. Disclaimer: I write this article not for fame, but to share what I have learned, so others can understand complex systems, prevent failure, and live better lives. This content is for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this article freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights belong to the author, Gerald C.